Once was a swagman camped by a billabong, under the shade of the coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited till his billy boiled, you'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Lukes here at thecrossroads.org, and we welcome Wallace Klinck from Canada.
Good morning, Arnie.
Oh, good morning, Arnis. Hello.
That's it? Yeah. So, okay, we're going to continue on with the previous week's recording on the individual, free, moral, and responsible. And we've been discussing it this week, and it's taken some interesting turns because the if you like, the teaching of the Old Testament puts the, if you like, the highest order of things to direct towards the state, that everything is towards the state or collectivism. And yet the New Testament made an issue of deconstructing that as a point of view and presented the individual as the highest form of in actual fact that I think the words were something like is the law and the prophets. The law and the prophets. I find that fascinating, that the law and the prophets is based on the individual, not on the state. And this is the Christian maxim, that the individual is paramount. But that doesn't mean that he's free to do whatever, but rather that he should be moral and responsible, and that also in his freedom he can't just look at himself, but he also has to look at his neighbour. In actual fact, that's one of the maxims is, only do unto him what you would have him do unto you. So the relationship between the individual and his fellows is paramount. And it's on this basis that law should be based and society should be based. And in actual fact, the history of the evolution of community and society is that individuals come together for mutual benefit. They come together so that originally in the agricultural form, civilizations were built up because they found that they could achieve the things that they needed by planting crops and putting up fences and having their stock around them. And so there was all this, if you like, evolution of civilization that started from that point and built up from that point. And the undoing of this civilization or evolution is when we direct authority and power outside of the individual. We direct it towards someone else, because we can say the majority this or the majority that, but in actual fact, once you start saying for the betterment of the majority, for the greater good, then what you're doing is you're actually isolating people, and you're causing the individual to suffer unnecessarily. And of course the tyrant rises up to control the majority, 50% plus one, against 50% minus one, that the majority have the right to impose their will over everyone else. And of course that's certainly not a Christian maxim, but rather that only do unto him what you'd have him do unto you. And I think that's absolutely fundamental if we're going to move forward on this discussion. So Wallace, I'd like to give you the floor and give us your thoughts on the individual.
Well, the thing of it is, Arnie, the individual is the only conscious being. A group has no consciousness. And certainly people associate in order to get results. And the association that they enter into should give them the results that they're seeking, and which is to their satisfaction. The group is an amorphous thing that is subject to emotion, but it is not always subject to reason. And it can be, as I think Betty mentioned, a mob. Gustav Le Bon had written that book on the crowd, I think it was called. And Douglas said that the individual hopes to emerge from the group, that the group is an atavism from which the individual hopes to emerge. the group is valuable to the individual if it is a group that is formed for a particular objective, and that it is stable, or that it is subject to change or to even abolition if necessary, if it doesn't give satisfaction. So that the individual should have the right to contract out as much as possible in order that the group is going to actually deliver satisfactory results. In collectivism, you don't have the option of contracting out. You're expected to conform. So it leads inevitably to a form of tyranny. The other view, where the individual is regarded as the only conscious entity capable of individual independent thought, is a completely different concept, and that leads to the concept of individual freedom. And freedom, as you say, Arnie, is not freedom to do just anything you want. It must be exercised with a sense of responsibility, respect, and love for your fellow citizen, your fellow man. Otherwise, it degenerates into a situation where there's not freedom. It is chaos, or it is devolves into tyranny. So it's very important. Social credit is really very much directed to the discussion of association, because we get increments from association, increments which are advantages which we could not achieve as individuals. If you have, say, a group of cavemen that are trying to move a big rock and they just can't budget, and this one particular caveman just happens to be a little brighter than the rest, and he said, "Look, you fellas, stand back, I've got an idea." And he gets a little rock and he gets a big stick and he moves the rock himself. He's invented something. He's invented the lever, and he's got a mechanical advantage, which, because he got an association between things properly, he was able to get a result that the entire group as individuals could not achieve. Same thing with the telephone exchange. The telephone exchange becomes increasingly valuable with the number of people who belong to the exchange. It can give you far more opportunity for communication, and the results that flow from communication or that develop on account of communication. So, I mean, and we have a cultural heritage. Our cultural heritage is a composite of these many, many advantages that we have achieved over time, which social credit calls the unearned increment of association. And our cultural heritage is what we really depend on and rely on for our future advancement, because we can't go back to inventing the wheel or the stick every time we want to do something. We have tremendous advantage if we have a cultural background to start on a higher level from which to start on a higher level.
Thanks for that, Wallace. And you touched on inheritance too, the cultural inheritance. And generally it is. It's by outstanding individuals who have actually drawn the civilization further on. I'm reminded of the bloke 120 years ago, 150 years ago, Nikola Tesla, and the polyphase rotating magnetic field, the electric motor. I mean, he changed from what was DC. Niagara Falls was actually geared up to run direct current power, and Tesla developed the alternating current generator, and of course it made this whole science, this whole industry branch obsolete. And that was just one person with a fascinating capacity to think engineering, to think in a fashion that balanced the way things are and not the way things ought to be. And I think that, to me, illustrates how we can actually lose. We can lose our inheritance if we head off. I know there's another illustration in Australia where we had light bulbs. The government mandated that you will use mercury-filled fluorescent tubes for light bulbs. And what happened in a response to that was that the cost went up, the reliability of the old style light bulbs went down, and the individual, it was industry, decided that, well, hang on, let's try LEDs. And they got LEDs to work, and now lights are up. Basically, that style of light is completely obsolete. technology keeps moving on. And of course, who inherits it? We all do. This is part of our technological inheritance. And so I know we're going to discuss a lot of this today. And I think that it's most important when we start talking about the individual. We've also got to consider that the inheritance that is there, that belongs to everyone. And when you say it belongs to everyone, I mean that it rests at the feet of the individual and not an elite group. So yes, I'm going to bring you up now, Betty, and it's your opportunity for the floor. Welcome.
Thank you, Arnie. Well, as Wally was talking, I was reminded of Don Octoloni sharing his experiences with local councils, local governments. And here in South Australia, there's quite an uproar because the local CEO used council funds to pay for his golf club fees. And this to me is the importance of understanding is not just the individual, but the individual who is moral and responsible that must be looked at, not just the rights of the individual. And I noticed that what he did was to repay the amount of money, and I think it headed towards $6,000 for his golf club fees. And he probably used the council's credit card that he had available to use. So anyhow, there was quite an uproar, and so he repaid that and offered an apology in the local paper. And this reminded me of what's happening in the political arena. And I brought it back to myself that if I had done that in out there in society, if I had taken $6,000 from my employer's till, wouldn't I have been charged with stealing? Or if I cooked the books, wouldn't it have been embezzlement? And instead of which, his response, which was accepted, this is what gets me, was that I'm not sure it was him, it was Sam Dastiari who said something about what he did was wrong. And he spoke about his error of judgment. And I could just see myself going before a local magistrate for stealing $6,000 from my employer's till and saying, well, look, I'm sorry, Your Honour, but it was an error of my judgment. Was it? It was a criminal activity, surely. Now, that to me is the important. I'm just giving that as an example of how our culture has deteriorated. There's lots of things going on in the political arena, and politicians are making excuses for their behaviour, whereas once the person would have realised that he had so dishonoured his own name and that of his family, and he would resign.
Thanks for that, Betty. That's exactly right. Politics, the politicians, the CEOs, the elites. Where this comes back to is essentially, in my view, is collectivism. It's the philosophy that there are a group of people who are sufficiently endowed with superior wisdom, and they see it within themselves the ability to make decisions on behalf of other people, and they can do no wrong. And of course, it's humbug. It won't hold ground. Our politicians are doing it. Our CEOs. That's right. It comes back to the individual. I mean, Peterson talks about tidying up your own room. It starts there. Speaking the truth. It starts there. These are most profound things. You can't do things on behalf of anyone other than yourself. You represent yourself every time. And I think it's just most important that we look at, first of all, ourselves. Not because the thing is, I see it as almost like a pathology that you need to make decisions for someone else. You need to, without their consultation, without their engagement on their behalf, I mean, the tyrant does it. The tyrant sees that, you know, he's wiser, he's more endowed with virtues that the average person doesn't have. And yet I'm of the view, and this to me is a Christian maxim, leave people alone to make their own decisions and let them work out their own utopia. Don't consider that you have a right to make decisions for someone else. And of course, this self-assessment is so vitally important. I notice you raised your hand, Betty, so I'm going to give you back the floor.
Well, I'm just reminded that it was Solzhenitsyn who said that the whole system was built on a lie, that the Soviet system was built on a lie, and everyone lied. And surely we've come to that stage here in the Western world.
Thanks, Betty. I appreciate your comment. Now, I notice Wallace has raised his hand, so I'm going to give Wallace the floor.
Well, it's another indication of the level of morality, I think, when politicians make apologies and say that they take full responsibility for what they have done. But of course, there are no penalties to be paid. They just simply apologize and think that everything is fine now. And so that really, there are no sanctions that are applied to them for their misdemeanor. And it's the same thing with Parliament. Parliament, they talk about the supremacy of Parliament. Parliament is not supreme. We have a system which puts God as being supreme, in other words, which puts natural law as supreme. And the politicians don't like that. They don't like constitutions, basically, because constitutions enshrine certain rights of the people in accord with an interpretation of natural law. And the politicians like to think that they have the ultimate power. In fact, they do not, or they should not, because it gives them a form of absolute authority over the people that they're not really entitled to.
Thanks for that, Wallace. I think that's very important. Our Australian Constitution, the preamble, begins with "We the people of the various states, humbly relying on the blessing of Almighty God, do agree." And so the Constitution, the supreme law of our land, begins with "We the people." It's a document that the people have agreed to. And we've forgotten that. Now, I know we've sort of diverged because we've gone off to individual sin, if you like. And I appreciate it's most important because it's a humbug. But what it's demonstrating to me is that in collectivism, if you give authority to another person, if you vote a representative in and they assume they're a delegate rather than a representative, they make decisions on your behalf that without consultation, and it can have vested interests in it, and of course they've got feet of clay, and that demonstrates again and again. Our constitution is limited. It's a limited constitutional monarchy. The authority of the federal government is specific in the constitution, and for over 100 years we've had collectivists attempting to tear it apart and undermine it, our judiciary, our politicians by other laws, essentially looking to undermine and destroy what's been built up to a point of, if you like, the high watermark of the going into the 20th century. The 1901, I think, was our year of federation. And the thing is that in Australia we have a Trinitarian form of government. It's not just the Queen, the upper house, the lower house in the federal sphere, but rather, and the purpose of that, of course, is to balance authority and responsibility. It's to transfer authority between more than one group, so that you don't have a monopoly, you don't have an autocracy. And the thing is that Queensland, which is the only state that has dissolved its upper house, and I think it's lacking because of it, because that House of Review is most important, of course, and then ultimately all law comes into being signed by the Governor of the states, or in the case of the federal government, by the Governor-General, the Queen's representative. So these, to me, are most important, that power and authority has to be devolved. It has to be brought to its its closest point, and if something can be done at its closest point, it must be done, rather than handing power to a higher authority. This is where, as individuals, we give up responsibility, and I think it's most important we come to grips with that. I'm just going to touch on something here. I see both hands up, and that's important. It's good. I'm just going to touch on one more thing, and that is the three levels of government in Australia. We have the federal government, we have the state governments, and we have councils. And each of those levels of government have three levels again: the mayor, the alderman, and the councillors. The governor, the upper house, the lower house in the states, and the governor general, the Senate, and the House of Representatives in the federal sphere. And then, of course, you've got judiciary and other branches. These are most important. I know that we're talking about politics and we're talking about systems, but the thing is that if your philosophy says that the power and authority is vested in the individual, all power and authority is vested in the individual, then it's got to be on that basis that you build systems around that. And I know that Australia has painstakingly harvested a cultural heritage that goes back millennia. British institutions of common law, Westminster system of parliament, of governments, etc., etc. Now, Wally, I'm going to give you the floor.
Well, the British have had a long experience with developing institutions to deal with power, and they have tried to devolve it or separate it in a responsible manner, because they had suffered under the divine right of kings, the taxation without representation, and so on. And basically, I think that the fundamental principle involved here is that the state can do nothing beyond what it is formally authorized to do, whereas the individual can do anything that the individual wants to do, provided it is not prohibited. And that is the difference between the Roman law of the continent and actually Quebec too. The difference between the Roman law and the British law. The Roman law is more the other way, whereas the state has a lot more power and the individual has less power. So that and you can see what's happened in Europe, and the European Union is a very tyrannical sort of structure. And this is not conducive to human freedom or to human happiness. And also questions of responsibility. I think that if human beings are indeed to be given freedom and expected to be responsible, then it is actually an immoral act on the part of the citizen to accord irresponsible power to people in government. And they must assure that they have sanctions to deal with breaches of power that take place within government.
Thanks, Wally. That's very important. That's right. And I know you've sort of drawn us a little bit towards the responsible vote, what I describe as the responsible vote, and we will touch on it, but we won't immerse ourselves on that subject today. We'll just concentrate on the individual and the free, moral, and responsible. Betty, you've got the.
Well, Arnie, I see that you cannot separate the importance of the individual from the freedom, morality, and responsibility of that individual. And after all, parliaments are made up of individuals. I understand that the party politics limits their freedom to choose or refuse, but they are individuals. And we were told that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we look around and we can see the corruption in so many places today, and certainly you see it in the parliaments here in Australia. So you cannot separate the importance of the individual and his responsibility. And you're talking, we spoke of the responsible vote, and I see it that you cannot separate that individual from his responsibility, his accountability for the decisions he makes. and that even goes.
Thanks, Patty. Sorry, I've jumped in on you. That's exactly right. You cannot separate it, and that to me is the key. That what we're exploring today is about setting up systems, because you've got to recognise that individuals can be corrupted, and so when you give more power, when you transfer authority and responsibility that you should be making across to someone else, they can be corrupted by that power. And in actual fact, they have been. The more power they get, it gets to the point where they're basically indifferent. I'm voted in, I'm going to do what I want. And the sad part, of course, is that in that we're wondering why. We're asking ourselves, why is our civilization in such chaos? Why are we tearing things apart, tearing things down? And we are, because we're tearing our civilization down. We're tearing the institutions down that we're actually founded on, and why we came together. And we're handing more and more responsibility to other people instead of ourselves. So it's a philosophical basis. It doesn't work. You've got to start looking now at what actually works. And the more power that an individual has, especially over his others, the more power he has to be corrupted. More opportunity, he has to be corrupted. Wallace.
Well, of course, corruption is like a virus. It tends to spread. Corruption in high places is often done by, well, other people are doing it, so does it really matter? And then, of course, the citizen looks on and sees this going on and feels disempowered and feels disillusioned and becomes cynical and does not withdraws from the process instead of exerting his responsible influence on it. And that, again, it corrupts the individual over which the corruption is being acted. So it's a reciprocal sort of thing. It leads to a degradation of society in general. So there is nothing like integrity. And
Thanks for that, Wallace. That's exactly right. I'm going to just pass it across to Betty, because I know she's jumping out of her seat to say something.
I thought I was behaving myself. I just can see that it's not just the politicians who have become corrupted, but it's the laws that they're putting into place that are corrupting the people as well. And the people have to recognize that. See, it still comes back to the individual, whether it's the systems or institutions, whatever. It still comes back to what the individual does within that group, and that, Wally, surely is the integrity. And I'm just reminded of Eric Butler's words. He quoted somebody else, but he said, what has happened is that the slave has come to love their chains. And that's where
Thank you. That's it. That's exactly right, Betty. The slave has come to love their chains. I was actually thinking of those very words myself. And I'm going to give Wallace another opportunity. Wallace.
Well, I think I remember Eric Butler saying that if you think that you don't want to be involved in politics, you'd better think again, because politics is definitely interested in you. And by that, I mean, or he meant, I'm sure, that politics would continue to centralize its power of taxation, its power of legalism to control the lives of the people, its response to lobby groups, the demands of lobby groups to serve their own purposes rather than the general good. And so I think that it is a dreadful delusion to say, oh, well, I'm not really interested in politics. Freedom needs constant vigilance. Otherwise, unfortunately, it doesn't come without a certain price. And the price really is not that high. It should be a delight and a joy to defend your freedoms. But if you neglect them, you'll pay a price and you'll lose your freedom.
Thanks, Wallace. That's exactly right, and that's the price we're paying. We've harvested our, if you like, our civilizational capital. We've been harvesting it and not returning back to it. The energy and effort for the last 100 years hasn't been there, insufficient, because we look at it and we see things, we see institutions, we see the lack of guidance from leaders that should be there, and it's not there. Everyone's become comfortable, and of course now we're seeing it become a basket case where our CEOs, our leaders, they're indifferent to anything. They're indifferent to their skin of leather. They're indifferent to whether what they did was moral or not. I mean, the senator last year who basically refused to resign, even though it looked like he was working for a foreign power. The deputy prime minister refuses to resign, even though he's in a publicly aware adulterous situation. I mean, this is crazy. These are supposed to be ministers to the crown. They're supposed to set an example over and above, and they're not doing it. And it comes back to, well, we've got to ask ourselves, where does it start first? It starts with us. It doesn't start with them. We can point the bone all we like, and we can say this is all this corruption. And I'm going to take us on another branch of this topic right now. I received an email today from a fellow, doesn't matter who, but it was about essentially the alt-right, saying that conservatives should be aligned with the alt-right, and another group. And the fact is, I'm very wary of, and I'll say it, I'm very wary of the alt-right, because it's another group, and it's not the individual thinking and coming together on agreement. It's actually, we've got a leader here, is proposing certain things, and he's got a point of view and says, give me the power and I'll sort it out. And of course, that's not the answer at all. The answer is responsibility. And I know Douglas touched on this. He touched on it quite specifically. The difference between the individuals in the British culture, and whereas you had structured nations where the individual would disappear, and it was on the basis that the individual rising up could actually protect himself and his community because of this creative spark that is within every single one of us. Wallace.
Well, the alt-right is a reaction. You have to think of it as a reaction. It's just like, similarly, the left is a reaction. Well, what are they reacting to? I think it would serve us very well to determine clearly in our minds what they are reacting to. Obviously, neither are satisfied. So what is causing the problem? The problems are related to poverty or to difficulty in surviving economically, and the real and perceived social injustices that come from all of that. And we can either say, well, that's the way life is, or we can say, well, maybe there is a resolution to that. And what we need is not a dialectical process where there's conflict going on, because conflict generates a lot of heat, but it doesn't always result in very many desirable ends. So what we have to do is we have to seek a resolution to that. We need a third resolvent power where human beings are allowed to associate, which is very important because we associate to achieve results in a way that is satisfactory and satisfying and beneficial to all citizens, so that they don't feel that they are being ill done by one sector or the other of the population. We should be working together as an organic organism, if you want a society comprised of individuals. But it's got to be flexible so that there's a right to contract out, of a maximum right to contract out. There's some institutions you can't contract out of, but generally speaking, the most functions in life are those which freedom of action is possible. And we've noticed in the past that who invents our marvelous scientific devices, achievements? It's usually people who have a good degree or a high degree of economic independence and the freedom to think creatively without being bound down to servitude in some some boring job. They are there.
Thanks for that, Wallace. Sorry, I've jumped over you. Thanks for that, Wallace. That's right. That the individual, if they're independent enough to have a secure position in life where the bills are paid and they have a base, it's on that basis that they can be as creative as they like. And from that, yes, society certainly can benefit from it. Society as a whole and not as a... yes. Anyway, Betty.
Yes, well, thank you, Arnie. What Wally had to say, of course, sparked my thought about the state election that's coming here in South Australia. And it does relate to the individual, Arnie, I assure you. And when I look at what the different parties are promising, well, they're promising more jobs, doing away with some of the high prices of the electricity. After all, we've got the highest prices of electricity in the world. And they're going to give us more government services. They're going to give us more government services. Well, you think about that. These are the bribes for the unthinking voter that they're going to do. And of course, from a social credit viewpoint, I thought of what needed to be known and is not discussed. And the first thing is that more jobs. What about automation? What about the precariat that don't have jobs now? And you think about the machine, and the machine, which is taking the place of human labour, that's the key to it. It's taking the place of human labour. Machines can work 24 hours a day. They don't seek sick leave. They don't seek holidays, and they're not paid a wage. There's no purchasing power distributed through the machines. But what about the suffering taxpayer? All of these things, you don't hear these matters discussed. You just see that the politicians are trying to bribe the uncommitted voter. You could say that. And that brings us to the social inheritance, the national dividends. There's no talk of reducing the overall debt. We're still going to be suffering under the financial system that is set up, and the people are not going to get any relief from the present situation.
I think that's really important, Betty, because where you're showing it is you're showing that the individual is being bribed on the behalf of the vote me in as representing the majority, and I'll bribe sufficient to get 50% plus one with their own money. With their own money, what derived benefit do I get? Oh well, I might get one of those jobs which are completely unnecessary. You've got to come back to first principles, and that is that who's putting their hand up in this election to represent you? Who's putting their hand up to actually canvass the electorate to make sure that we're constantly looking at what's real and how it's going to work? I mean, you mentioned the debt, but what about taxation? You know, why is it, you know, one group will say, well, we're going to put a ceiling on council rates. Ceiling on council rates. Council rates are pegged at a value of the property, and with inflation, which is a federal policy, with inflation, the property continues to increase in numerical value. It doesn't really increase in real value, but in numerical value, and that means that the council rates continue to increase at the rate of inflation. And so the councils continue to draw more money. So it's a deceitful thing from the start. You've got to come back to, yes, no one is, when I say yes, no one is asking the right question about the financial system. No one is asking or mentioning about community banking. No one is asking about redemption of debt. No one is asking about less government services and more personal responsibility. It's all about collectivism. It's all about bribing the electorate, and every one of them in the parties is just lining up to bribe you. That's the point. And the thing is, as an individual, when we talk about responsibility, you've got to really you've got to look at yourself and say, well, hang on a sec, which one of these is going to even begin to represent me? Or is it just the lesser of the evil, or do I actually derive a benefit from this that I take from my neighbour in order for me to have this? I mean, that's what's going on. And no morals, no ethics, nothing in it at all. It's just bribery. And of course, to me, it's a farce. The parties, the major parties, are all just shifting deck chairs. They're not changing policy. They're not changing policy at all. They're all for big government. SA Best is all for big government. It's all for this new green energy. Nothing about getting the price down. Says a premier has to resign in 2 years if the price of electricity is not down in two. These are all just gimmicks. Nothing about representation. This bloke knows about citizens' initiative referenda. He knows about representative government, and he's moved away from it. He won't touch it, not with a 10-foot pole. Okay, I'm going to give the floor back to Wallace. Wallace.
Well, it seems to me that a responsible and competent businessman would not be concerned about creating jobs. He would be concerned about creating goods and services with an absolute minimum of cost. Politicians, of course, are all concerned about the employment rate. Oh, it is so much better. It's gone down from 6 to 4.5%. Well, I say, you mean to tell me that it takes 94, 5, 6% of the population to provide our essential and desired needs or wants? I said, that's terribly inefficient. If we can actually achieve a situation where we had, say, a 90% unemployment rate, then we'd have something to really be overjoyed about. So we just have such a completely inverted sense of reality and sense of ethics that it is almost unbelievable when you really start to think about it. And of course, creating employment, of course, is an issue that serves the politicians' ends because it's an issue to play upon, and it also gives the spending usually more and more to the state because the state moves in to try and boost the employment rate. So that enhances the power of the state.
Thanks, Wallace. That's right. I touched on when I say I touched on a book the other day by Emar Duffy, and it was about money and finance. And he was talking about the unemployed, and the unemployed was approached and say, well, what do you want? He says, I want a job. I said, is that really the right answer? Do you want a job, or do you want spending power sufficient to give your basic needs? And when you think about it, that's exactly right. The unemployed doesn't need a job. Let the robots do it. What the unemployed needs is spending power sufficient to achieve their basic needs. And if he chooses to remain unemployed, that's fine. But once you've covered your base, once you've got food in your belly and you've got a home to live, clothes to wear, you're at least in a position of say, okay, I'm confident where I am. What am I going to do now? And every person should have that opportunity. Every person, not just the ultra rich who are harvesting really their predecessors, their parents, grandparents' inheritance. So on that side of it. All right, Betty.
Well, I was thinking of the fact that they're all pushing for us to have jobs, even increasing the retirement age so that the older people still continue to work, no matter that they might have spent their whole lifetime in hard work and building up the capital and the social structure, physical social structure, that the young are now enjoying. And what was the point I wanted to get across there? I'll leave it to you for a minute.
All right, thanks, Betty, for that. I'm going to give the floor back to Wallace. Wallace.
Well, I think Douglas made the point that according to his observation, there seems to be a concerted effort to make incomes primarily due to work, and that dividends are given instead of expanding the dividend system to actually reduce the dividend system. And that goes back to the idea of those so-called nobility of work for its own sake, or the value, the labor theory of value. And as I've said before, the labor theory of value is, Douglas said that value is a subjective thing. The labor theory of value is unsound because, as I say, you can spend enormous effort on producing something that nobody in the world would buy. They wouldn't value it in any way at all. You would have a tremendous amount of cost involved, but what you produce was of no value. So the labor theory of value is completely unsound. And of course, with the advent of technology, labor is being replaced rapidly anyway. But so there are these things to consider. What we need is an expansion of the dividend system, not a reduction of it. An expansion of it to embrace the entire population increasingly as the machine produces our needs and wants.
Thanks, Wallace. That's right. And I'd direct our viewers and listeners to social credit, which is a policy of freedom. Policy of freedom. Now, social credit has the training, if you like, the training documents in the ALOR library, and you've also got a good bite out of just about everything that Douglas has written on the ALOR library website, and also, of course, Eric Butler. And these were Eric being, in a sense, the protege of Douglas as a young man, never having met him, but certainly understood where Douglas was coming from and what he was on about. And of course, Eric presented that in a fashion that caused individuals to become activists, to bring about a social credit, if you like, a social credit society, a social credit dispensation, where let the robots do the work. But that's only part of it. Social credit is a policy about freedom, and freedom also has two branches, other branches, and that's morality and responsibility. And I think it's absolutely fundamental that we hold those two close together. Remember that in a stool, you can't stand a stool up unless you've got at least 3 legs. It won't stand. 2 legs, dualities, monopolies won't stand. And so with the Christian concept, Trinitarian concept, we've got to look at what actually works in our world, and it's very much there for us to think about. Now, Betty, have you remembered yet?
Yes, I have. Of course, it is, that they've made it a world of work, and they're desperately trying to get us all doing something, even to the extent of the young unemployed having to apply for jobs that are not there, so that they don't go around and feel that maybe they'd like to do something different. And to do something different, you need a policy from another philosophy, and that philosophy is Christianity. And the concept of leisure doesn't mean doing nothing, but the concept of leisure. And as Jeremy Lee pointed out in one of his articles, that England had, I think it was, I've forgotten just how many, 150 holidays in their calendar, because the church had a great influence on the people of England going back a few hundred years. Maybe Wally would like to comment on that further.
Just hang on a sec, Wally. Just while we're looking at that and we're thinking about it, actually I've lost my train of thought now because you've become host, Betty. So don't do that again. You confuse me. Well,
I often ask, I remind them that during the days of Merry England, people had about 150 holidays per year. And not only that, but apparently they only had to work a few weeks to provide their basic needs. Now, their needs were not as complex as they are today, but nevertheless, they were able to do that, and they were able to devote their lives to other things, spiritual things, and so on. I suppose a lot of the great cathedrals that must have been built under some tremendous inspiration. When you consider the times, I'm sure that there must have been a lot of contributed time to that. I'm not sure just exactly how they were financed, but it's just that. Now I lost my line of thought for just a second.
This is excellent. This is excellent. I'm okay with that. We have big weeks, and I must admit, by the end of the week, we're all thudded. Friday is a very big day for me. It starts early, and I know that these two forum members are stalwarts to what we're doing here. I think it's most important. Um, I'm okay with winding today's session up. We've gone 50 minutes. I think that's pretty good, and I think that we come back to the individual, how important it is. Christianity is filled with the policy of the philosophy being that the individual is paramount, that all authority, all responsibility, all morality comes from the individual. Peterson talks about the tidying up your room, and that to me is most important. We can't sort what's going out in the world. We can't sort it out unless we come back to ourselves as a first. Now, Solzhenitsyn warned us. Everyone lied. Everyone had a vested interest. Everyone did what they did for themselves, and they didn't consider their neighbour. And this is where Jesus warns us very clearly. Only do to him what you'd have him do to you. He warns us. He warns us. How clearer can that be? So when you as a if you are a collectivist, if you are a Marxist or a fascist or whatever, you think about it. You say, if I have the power, I would do this. Well, hang on a sec. Can you really be trusted? Can you really, someone gives you what you want? Can you really be trusted with power, with money, with glory, with whatever? Or should it rest with the individual having authority to make his own choices, his own utopia? And that to me is what it's about. Now, I've got two people waving their hands frantically. They're not going to let me close out. So I'm going to tell a lie. I'm going to do ladies first. Betty.
I don't want to say too much. I just want Wallace to talk about the national dividend at this stage, because there needs to be a mechanism by which the individual is secure. And
Thanks for that, Betty. That's exactly right. And I'm going to hand it to Wallace, because when I say social credit is a policy of freedom, it's about empowering the individual to set out and pursue their own ends within reason, within responsibility. So Wallace, the social dividend, the consumer price discount, these are mechanisms whereby sufficient spending power would rest with the individual to purchase what industry makes. Wallace.
Well, the national dividend is simply an administrative action that flows from a policy, and that policy comes from a philosophy. The philosophy is to maximize the freedom of the individual, as you say. And the dividend, from a technical standpoint, is not as complicated and as abstruse as some people would like to make it. Actually, the money that is being paid to facilitate consumption is being paid now. Some people think that social credit is going to issue a whole lot of new money, inflate the money supply, and create a rise in prices and ruin the whole economy. Not so. The banks today they have consumers up to their necks in debt, and they have created that money that they have lent to them. And that money, when spent, has been canceled. Now, the dividend would be issued in a similar manner, but it would be issued without debt, and it would be deducted from a properly constructed national credit account, which would simply be an inventory, if you want, of the productive assets, the value of the productive assets of the nation as estimated at a given time. So, and it would reduce that account, but the thing of it is we are always producing new capital, and so the account would always be building. So it wouldn't be issued as debt. But it would do the same thing that these bank-issued credits were doing, in the sense that it would liquidate the cost of production, because it would be paid back to the producer and in the usual way, and the producer would pay his bank for the production loan that he had incurred, and it would be canceled. And it would only be a question of a recycling process, a new cycle of production, wherein more new money was issued for new production, paid out, but only a portion of it going as labor, wages, salaries, and dividends, which is genuine purchasing power. But the rest of the costs that it would create would be made out from things brought in from a previous costing cycle, which don't pay out incomes, but do add to prices. So in the usual way, the dividend would compensate for that, similar to the way that the bank issued debt credit compensates today. Basically, it amounts to this. The banks have stolen the public credit. It is a gigantic system of legalized counterfeiting. We want to restore the ownership of that credit to the community in consumption rights, the right to partake of the benefits which flow from a productive system.
Thanks, Wallace. That's exactly right. That the social credit financial proposal is about balancing the economy so that the spending power is sufficient to purchase and liquidate what industry makes, what the community makes, and of course by doing so, you only have to look at how the existing system is working. Go to any debt clock on the internet, and you'll see that it's tangentially going up. It's not going up a little bit. This is going up at angles like this, like logarithmic levels of debt, and it's a fraud. It's a trick. And where social credit is about is that the two streams, finance and production, are balanced, and it's most important that you look at that. You don't need to understand, in a sense, too deeply the technical aspects of what social credit is proposing. What you need to understand is the policy, and the policy is about freeing the individual so that they're secure in their own sovereign right to participate in industry if they choose or refuse, to support technology that will reduce jobs, and at the same time still have a secure base that sees their basic needs met. This is most important. Now, the collectivists, they don't like it at all. In fact, they actively and vigorously, violently oppose social credit. They always have. And in the early days of the social credit movement, millions and millions of dollars were directed towards ensuring that it would never happen. It would never be allowed to see the light of day. So governments, privy councils, whatever, have done everything they can to stifle this discussion on social credit. But come back to what we're on about today. What we're on about is that the individual must be free. And if he's a slave financially, if he's a wage slave, he's not free at all. If he's beggar thy neighbour, if he's emasculated by the financial system, if he's controlled by never-ending streams of laws coming out by the bureaucrats, by the governments, this is all about control. This is not about freeing the individual at all. This is about elevating the state to some obscure entity where these profound wise people can rule over us, when of course what we talked about earlier on was just how those profound wise people are not. They are not. They're corrupt, and they're self-centered, they're selfish, and they refuse to even acknowledge the fact that they have human frailties like we all do. Wallace.
Well, the thing of it is, we mentioned before that the free individual has more scope for his creative instincts and abilities. In the bureaucratic state, communist state, the fascist state, policy is set by the state, and for the purpose of achieving state policy. And the philosophy is not necessarily at all to satisfy the individual, to free the individual. And you must understand a philosophy and the policy that flows from it if you're going to get a grasp on this situation. Because if you don't have that clearly in your mind, you're going to be confused by all sorts of the usual jargon and all of the economists talk about employment and unemployment and inflation and all that sort of thing. We need an economy which delivers the goods to all the citizens as a whole, and frees them by giving them independent or economic independence. Douglas said, we don't know what society is going to be like, but it could only take its most desirable form when people have absolute economic security. And we know that we can give that today because we have enormous productive capacity. So we know that we can do that.
Thanks, Wallace. That's exactly right. And I think we've covered some very good ground today. and I'm going to bring us to a close. This video will be placed up on YouTube. Arnis